in mid-February 2020, and subsequent news reports and events emerged, that the full implications began to unfold. This report triggered a crash in global equity prices, with a dramatic 35% drop over just a few weeks. This tumultuous period continued until the situation stabilized and markets were reassured that policymakers, including central banks worldwide, stood ready to prevent a massive crisis in confidence. The public health measures that were implemented inevitably led to large contractionary forces, primarily supply shocks with substantial inflationary implications. As countries transitioned into the opening up phase, we also faced the challenge of managing expansionary forces on the demand side. Our central objective throughout this period was to prevent long-term inflation expectations from ratcheting up. Indeed, one of the lessons we learned from 1970s, explicitly incorporated into the development of Mark I frameworks, is that shocks like this are proximate causes of inflation. Monetary policy is ultimately responsible for determining whether these shocks become persistent and get entrenched in underlying wage and price setting behaviors and long-term inflation expectations. In Armenia, the COVID crisis was followed by a successive layering of crises, including geopolitical confrontation that presented unprecedented challenges for us. The Central Bank of Armenia's response during this crucial or critical time could almost be described as one of those least regrets. Learning from the international experiences of 1970s and recent stagflationary challenges faced by other countries, we adopted a proactive stance. Our economy's sensitivity to these shocks necessitated a tighter monetary policy stance to ensure that we avoided what Olivier Blanchard has termed dark corners where danger lurks. These dark corners include situations of great macroeconomic instability, such as allowing inflation expectations to become de-anchored. Our decisive actions were key in navigating these unprecedented times. At the same time, while we adequately dealt with these risks and helped avoid these dark corners of macroeconomic or policy instability, this unforgiving succession of crises forced us to sit down and ask a very fundamental questions about the nature of good policy making and good frameworks. Amid such high uncertainty, how could one develop a single interpretation of what was happening and forecast that future with any degree of legitimacy? What type of communications would effectively convey the richness and complexity of our policy discussions without minimizing the uncertainty we're facing or limiting our policy agility? What is monetary policy fundamentally about? Is serving as an expert forecaster of the most likely future, or most effectively managing the high degree of risk and uncertainty that is always at the core of policy making? This line of thinking led us to develop FPAS Mark II, an evolution of existing best-in-class monetary policy making frameworks to better address what we believe to be the greatest policy imperative of our time, appropriately and systematically dealing with risk and uncertainty. I note that good frameworks aren't just about processes and policies. Robust framework that stand the test of the time requires serious investment in institutional capacity building, most importantly in the standards we set out for our people, teams to operate them. Let me now complete my remarks by outlining the organization of the day. Vahe Avakyan will lead off and talk about the major elements in our prudent risk management approach, including how it has transformed the quarterly production process at the Central Bank of Armenia. He will also discuss how the staff interacts with the board to produce the best monetary policy report. His presentation will highlight the importance of human capital and how FPAS Mark II emphasizes productivity and embeds economics in the design of every issue relevant for considering the three essential ingredients to our policy. Question number 1, where is the economy today? Question number 2, what are the underlying forces? And last but not least, and of course, what do we need to do with our instruments to achieve our objectives? To illustrate this, he will provide an example of non-traded sticky prices, which we believe offers a better proxy for price stability and organizes our thinking about the monetary policy transmission mechanism. We're very pleased to have Charles Goodhart and Athanasios Orphanidis join us. Charles will discuss his agreement with our approach to providing scenario-based forward guidance. However, he raised valid concerns about how journalists and politicians might continue to demand baseline projections. Our objective is to address this issue by demonstrating that we have a richer, more effective approach, more aligned with the reality of making monetary policy under uncertainty. Athanasios will then discuss the role of simple rules, not as things that policymakers want to blindly follow, but that policymakers can use as a frame of reference to describe why they are not following simple rules. We also welcome Deputy Governor Ekaterina Mikabadze from National Bank of Georgia. Her insights will be particularly valuable given the similarities and differences in our respective monetary policy frameworks. With FPAS Mark II, we emphasize individual accountability on the board, a principle that also holds significance in Georgia's monetary policy framework. It will be enlightening to hear her perspective on how these frameworks operate in different institutional contexts, especially under a governor decision-maker model, that of Georgia. I'm also delighted to welcome Yuri Shasford, if I pronounce the surname correctly, from Money and Macro, who will focus on the importance of monetary policy communication. His expertise in the area of communications and improving economic and financial literacy will shed light on how effective communication strategies can augment the impact of monetary policy, particularly in an environment marked by complex economic challenges and uncertainties. As we proceed with the symposium, each presentation and discussion is geared towards deepening our understanding and enhancing our approaches to monetary policy in the face of global economic complexities. This symposium is not just a platform for sharing knowledge. It is a confluence of ideas shaping. Thank you once again for your participation and contributions. Let us embark on these 2 days of rich discussion and learning with the aim of advancing our collective knowledge and practices in the realm of monetary policy. Thank you, and I'll pass the floor to Vahe.
Thank you, Governor. So I'd like to begin this presentation by kind of setting the ground rules a little bit in terms of what we're going to be discussing. And I think the Governor really laid a lot of the kind of conceptual underpinnings for our framework and really mapped out the overall process of how we got here. And he also mentioned, of course, the fact that frameworks are very kind of complex systems by their nature, and that they include a number of different kind of complex facets. And so we're going to go through this presentation in the hopes of giving you a better understanding of the framework at large, and kind of at a high level looking at some of the specific aspects of the framework, but of course recognizing that we're going to be leaving a lot of things out. And so some of our sessions later on throughout this conference will be covering some of these issues in detail. For example, tomorrow at noon Armenia time, we have a session dedicated to human resources. So we'll be talking about some of the human capital issues there. And of course, throughout the conference, we'll be touching upon some of the more specific elements as well. But to begin, as the governor mentioned, we, over the course of the past few years, certainly for as long as economics has been a profession, but certainly over the course of the past few years, we in Armenia and around the world have been faced with, I think as the governor termed it, an unforgiving kind of succession of crises. And those crises that we face, and we face these types of things all the time, but in particular, I think in a condensed fashion over the past 3 years, kind of forced us to sit down and ask very fundamental questions about the essence and nature of what monetary policy is about, what we're hoping to achieve when we conduct monetary policy, and how we might set up our institutions, our organizations, and our people to better be in service of this mission. And so when we think about what the purpose of monetary policy is, and we've really distilled this into probably the most kind of simplistic point of view, but I think it's important to ask these kind of rather elementary seeming or fundamental questions about this question. First, whenever we're kind of confronted with any type of situation, our job as policymakers is to first and foremost very soberly analyze the risks that we're facing. And in doing so, we then start with our analysis and try to understand where the economy is today, what the driving forces are, and where the key uncertainties lie. Given that assessment, that understanding, right, this is kind of a fundamental essence of how we approach economic analysis under kind of FPAS type frameworks. Our job then as policymakers and decision makers is to do whatever is necessary to bring inflation back to target and to stabilize the economy. The most important kind of caveat or kind of extension of this idea is that the essence of good policy fundamentally is about avoiding sliding into dark corners. That's the term by, of course, Olivier Blanchard, and that includes things like dangerous nonlinearities. This is, if we allow as policymakers the economy to enter into these situations, it can become very, very costly for us to then steer the economy back to stabilization. This can have very serious adverse kind of welfare outcomes for society at large. And these are, of course, things that we want to avoid first and foremost as socially responsible and accountable kind of public sector institution, but also making sure that we're doing our job well. And so in thinking of kind of monetary policy within this formulation, which I think is very much kind of aligns with how a lot of people conceptually and logically think about what the role of monetary policy is, this naturally leads us to the formulation of thinking of monetary policy as an exercise in risk management. So given this kind of intellectual background, which I'm sure, again, like I mentioned, is quite straightforward and aligns with how many people think about this issue, the question then becomes, how do we design a framework within which we conduct and make and communicate monetary policy that does the following three things? First, that it addresses this issue of uncertainty in monetary policy making. This issue of uncertainty is something that we recognize as being a fundamental, essential, unavoidable aspect of the work that we do when we are dealing with the economy. Second, that shifts the focus of policymaking away from this idea of trying to be an expert forecaster of the most likely future and trying to optimize the policy path for that most likely future to a different kind of formulation, which is ensuring more policy agility and the ability for us, while maintaining and preserving our credibility, to have policy agility in times of great uncertainty. The last thing, which touches upon that kind of most important lesson from the prior slide, is that we want this framework to recognize that important nonlinearities can kick in, and they can drag the economy towards dangerous dark corners. These might include things like the effective lower bound, getting stuck in a low or high inflation trap, on that latter point, allowing inflation expectations to become significantly de-anchored, and thus putting ourselves in a situation where our credibility is at stake. And of course, with credibility once lost, it becomes very difficult for us to regain. So designing a framework from the ground up that allows us to kind of have these three kind of essential ingredients in play is very important. Now, when we talk about monetary policy making frameworks today, we of course didn't start with nothing. So we of course owe a lot in terms of the existing frameworks that are in place that are considered gold standard today. The Central Bank of Armenia, before this, of course, adhered to the first generation of the forecasting and policy analysis system, or FPAS for short. This was, of course, developed in the late 80s and 90s primarily at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand and the Bank of Canada, in response to a lot of the lessons learned from the Great Inflation of the 1970s. And of course, some of those lessons learned that was then taken and attempts were made to institutionalize that within a broader systematic approach to making monetary policy and communicating it. This is very important because what some of the novel features that were introduced as part of the original FPAS frameworks, I think, have gone a long way in terms of improving how we make and communicate monetary policy. These include things like a well-defined target for inflation, where policy is intended to guide expectations, including endogenous, objective, consistent paths for policy, while also emphasizing its forward-looking nature. And lastly, and this is one of the more important innovations of the original FPAS, is this idea of having a systematic and transparent communication of policy, where we move away from this idea of there being kind of doctors knows best or kind of a black box of how policy is made and trying to surprise markets. We're actually introducing a systematic and forward-looking, transparent manner for communicating policy. And this goes a long way also in kind of ensuring and setting the foundations for our accountability and also central bank independence. Of course, very important aspects when we're thinking about these things. So with this kind of context in mind, right, these frameworks certainly served us very, very well and incorporated, like I mentioned, a lot of the lessons learned from kind of the previous great inflationary period that we faced. But as we kind of entered into this period of the 2020s, and like I mentioned in Armenia, the successive layering of shocks that we faced, first the COVID crisis, then followed by significant kind of geopolitical turbulence, it became very clear that the existing frameworks, while they might have served very well along that journey of kind of improving how we make and communicate monetary policy, they might perhaps fall short in a number of key areas. And those areas where they fall short, I think, represented for us kind of a light bulb moment for opportunities to really revamp how we approach those key issues. So what are the places where these frameworks fall short? First and foremost, we find that there's a lot of attention paid to linear models and an overemphasis on the act of modeling itself, modeling as the ends rather than the means, rather than paying attention in particular to the economics that underlies the models. Of course, within our framework and how we think about things, modeling plays a very, very important role, but we think it's important to be very sensible about it. And one of the areas where kind of standard approaches to these technical models fell short is their kind of how they pay insufficient attention to dangerous nonlinearities. And these include things like endogenous policy credibility, things like a nonlinear Phillips curve. These are importantly things that we incorporate into our nonlinear models that we'll be talking about in a moment. And then the second point is this idea that economists oftentimes, and certainly policymakers, tend to fall back on their decisions or their explanations using language like the model says this or the Kalman filter says this, as opposed to the more kind of sensible and healthy idea, which is kind of the original way that we all want to be thinking about models, which is they're tools to help us kind of support good economic thinking. So our focus, first and foremost, is on the economic thinking, and the models are a tool to help us support that. We'll come back later on in the presentation to talk about kind of a specific example of how we actually treat these kind of analytical tools within our framework. The kind of more fundamental kind of communications related aspect of the existing frameworks really has to do with this issue of the baseline scenario. So the original research that really kicked off our new framework was a paper that was published in October of last year, which was titled FPAS Mark II, Eliminating the Folly in Baselines and Local Approximations. So the local approximations bit we talked about, but the baseline bit is very important because we find that a baseline scenario, when it's used as the primary vehicle for central bank communications, actually can create a lot of self-imposed traps for us. First, I think one of the issues with the baseline scenario is that it tends to assign a false sense of assurance, whether we intend it or not, to the baseline as this representation of a most likely future. Of course, there's a lot more nuance in terms of how we internally tend to think about what the baseline scenario is and is not. But when we think about how the public tends to perceive or external stakeholders tend to perceive that baseline scenario, that nuance is often lost. What is more important is that the baseline focuses us on centering on a single interpretation of a highly unlikely future, of a highly uncertain future, and also a lot of uncertainty about the current economic environment itself. So when we, in times of kind of significant uncertainty, and when we think about this, a number of periods from recent years might come to mind, but for example, the kind of early inflationary period following the COVID crisis might come to mind, where it's very unclear and uncertain about how, what was actually driving the inflation, where was, the economy at that exact point in time, and then where might we be headed. There's a significant amount of uncertainty in terms of where that's going. And so centering on this single baseline view tends to kind of mask that uncertainty in a way that we don't want to do that. And it puts us in a self-imposed kind of trap that limits our policy agility moving forward, such that when we find that our interpretation that we've been arguing in a baseline scenario proves to be false, or proves to perhaps unfold in a way that was different than what we were previously communicating, we find that our hands are kind of tied, and it becomes much more difficult and costly for us to kind of switch gears and argue for a different interpretation than what we were previously saying. So this, again, the key idea here is that the baseline scenario puts us in a self-imposed bind. So is there a better way, perhaps, for us to be thinking about kind of quantitative forward guidance under these frameworks rather than this singular interpretation? So before we turn to that, I wanted to kind of mention one of the kind of intellectual underpinnings for this work. So we mentioned that this kind of formulation, that succession of questions that we talked about early on that got us to thinking about this idea of monetary policy as risk management, a lot of this is rooted in ideas that have existed in the world of policymaking for many years. And so our framework of FPAS Mark II represents an attempt to actually institutionalize and operationalize this idea within a framework. But this idea, I want to read this quote by Alan Greenspan that goes back to 2004, if I'm not mistaken, at Jackson Hole, where he says, the MPRM approach emphasizes understanding as much as possible many sources of risk and uncertainty that policymakers face, quantifying those risks when possible, and finally assessing the costs associated with each of those risks. And this formulation, I think, very much aligns with how we also kind of logically think about the role of monetary policy. So the task at hand becomes, how does one kind of institutionalize this idea that, again, makes a lot of sense within a framework, within a systematic approach to policymaking? And so to do that, we need to come back to these kind of essential ingredients of what kind of underpins our approaches to monetary policy. So the forecasting and policy analysis system that we talked about is really built around answering these three essential questions, as the governor mentioned. First, where is the economy now? Understanding what what our starting point is. Second, what are the underlying forces driving the economy? And finally, given that reading and given that assessment of those underlying forces, which includes an assessment of where the key sources of risk and uncertainty lie, what do we need to do with our policy instruments in order to achieve our policy objectives? This is the kind of most essential ingredient of having a forward-looking framework, in the sense that it is in many ways what our entire kind of credibility of our system rests upon. It's how we link the decisions that we're making with our analysis and our reading of the economy and our reading of the risks and areas of uncertainty. And that interconnection, that is kind of the process of communicating all that. That's where the transparency comes in. That's where the importance of kind of high quality communications comes in. So within this kind of broader context is where we kind of move within the framework itself. So to come back to this question of how do we think about kind of quantitative forward guidance, or forward guidance at large within our framework. And so I mentioned the issues that were associated with the baseline scenario itself. And our proposal, again, keeping in mind some of the issues and the limitations of having a singular interpretation, is to rely instead on scenarios-based forward guidance. And the way we construct these scenarios is that rather than representing this kind of most likely future, as a baseline scenario attempts to do or is conceived of as doing, we instead case scenarios. And so these are not, again, representations of a most likely future in the sense of baseline. They're not multiple versions of a baseline or alternative scenarios, but rather these are illustrative scenarios that serve as examples of policy responses to relevant types of risks and uncertainties. Why is it important that these scenarios are illustrative? Well, as we think about kind of forward guidance, we think that good forward guidance obviously includes an element of both quantitative forward guidance and qualitative forward guidance. That qualitative forward guidance includes things like a narrative-based discussion of the relevant policy issues And so the scenarios serve as a helpful kind of tool or prop for us to discuss qualitatively these narratives and risks and uncertainties. So the way we structure these case scenarios, they're built around market expectations of the future path of the policy rate, which we glean from data from the markets, and we construct a case A and case B scenario. And a case A scenario reflects one with what Larry Summers has termed hotter economic conditions, where the policy rate path would need to be higher than what's priced into market expectations. The case B scenario is the opposite of that, where we have cooler economic conditions requiring the policy rate path to be lower than what the market is priced in. In certain situations, we may find it useful to also include these what we term case X or Y kind of tail risk scenarios that are primarily about avoiding dark corners. So these might include some of those kind of dark corners that I talked about earlier, such as a high and variable inflation, where there's a risk of inflation expectations becoming de-anchored, or something like a low inflation trap, for example. And so the way we build these scenarios around the market expectations as these illustrative scenarios allows us in our communication and in our forward guidance to have an open discussion of the risks and uncertainties. And this, we think, helps us maintain credibility. And why is that the case? Because the way these scenarios are constructed and the way we develop our narratives that accompany these scenarios is actually intended to reflect very much the process by which decision makers actually arrive at a decision. And this kind of idea of having true transparency in terms of the thinking that leads, again, the third essential ingredient of what are we doing with our policy instruments to reach our policy objectives, this approach, we believe, really helps us do that. Rather than kind of having a single baseline approach where we're really constrained within a singular interpretation, here we're being very open and honest about what the sources of uncertainty are, where we believe the key risks to be, and in making our decision, which types of risks are we trying to manage. And these scenarios serve as kind of helpful props to help us frame that discussion, as opposed to being the kind of primary endpoint of our decision itself. So I'd like to now turn to the process by which we actually operationalize a lot of these ideas within the FPAS Mark II framework. So the typical process by which projections are done and decisions are made in most central banks is typically on a quarterly basis. And so at the Central Bank of Armenia, we have 4 quarterly decisions where we go through a full policymaking round. And in between those 4 quarterly decisions, we have what we call kind of interim decisions, where the board makes a decision on the policy rate, but that isn't accompanied by a full kind of projection round. And so this is kind of, we find typically pretty common practice at many central banks. But in terms of how our policymaking cycle works, under traditional formats, the policymaking cycle typically lasts around 2 months, and it becomes a very kind of strenuous exercise, in particular because of how the baseline scenario is constructed as, again, this kind of expert representation of the most likely future. So because we tend to kind of think of our work more in the context of producing illustrative scenarios where the discussion is about the key risks and the uncertainties, this allows us to significantly streamline a lot of the processes related to the projection round. So our projection round lasts about half the time as is typical, about 29 days or just under a month. And it begins with a kickoff meeting where the board and the staff gather. And this is primarily a meeting intended to get discussion going among board members. So board members are having an open and honest discussion about the current economic drivers, about the major concerns and tail risks, what they find to be the key issues, coming into that meeting and coming into the round. And this is important because we want to give the opportunity under this framework to allow board members to represent their individual ideas, to put forth their kind of interpretations, to talk about what they believe are the key risks that they're trying to manage in the current round. And this is, I think, a very important kind of fundamental principle for our framework. So after this kickoff meeting where, the board has received a briefing from the staff about the current economic conditions, they've had their kind of open discussions about what the current issues are, they then go away and work with a couple coordinators from the staff who help them put together these kind of one-page initial macroeconomic risk assessments where they talk about what they believe are the key kind of issues for them in the current round in the context of the case A and the case B type scenarios. And so the purpose of this really is to get the board members to write down on a piece of paper and through a kind of formal setting the actual what they think are the most important risks. And this is important to get them kind of thinking very early on in the process about the risks themselves and the ingredients that might make up case A and case B scenarios. So the board members, after spending about a couple weeks working on these things, then submit these initial macro risk assessments internally to the chief economist. And the chief economist looks at that information. And of course, throughout this period, the staff themselves have been working on kind of current economic analysis as well. And so in thinking about that, there's kind of been developed this kind of taxonomy or universe of risks and issues that might exist in the current policy round. That includes some of the input from the members of the board, and that also includes things gleaned from the staff's economic analysis, as well as information that's contained in markets and so on. And so that leads to kind of the scenarios meeting where the chief economist and the staff present to the board what the kind of ideas are for the case A and the case B scenarios. So what are the ingredients and the narratives that make up the illustrative scenarios? The chief economist and staff then go away to actually systematically build out and quantify the scenarios. And throughout this process, the board members, having received all this information through the regular kind of information sharing that's taking place, they then kind of go away and are thinking about again, these key issues of risk, having kind of impromptu discussions and meetings with other board members and perhaps with the staff as well, to help them kind of get thinking about the key issues. 4 days prior to the decision, the scenarios are locked in. And then when we get to decision day, the decision is then made. So this follows a kind of very robust meeting and discussion among the board members where they're talking about the key sources of risk and the key issues. And then, of course, we move on to the issue of external communication. So we'll touch on that in a little bit. So I understand this this aspect of the framework can seem a bit kind of operational and procedural and in the weeds, but this is important because I think it highlights a number of things. First, this kind of idea that we want to have a lot of kind of open deliberations and thinking and encouraging alternative viewpoints among members of the board. And two, making sure that we're having kind of a lot of touch points and healthy engagements between the board and the staff throughout the process. So how are we actually enhancing the decision-making process by taking this approach? First, by abandoning the baseline, we're eliminating the need to achieve consensus around a single worldview. So naturally, it's very difficult to get decision makers or any group of people to achieve, to have consensus around what's driving the key issues at any given point. And so this approach where we focus on the key sources of risk and uncertainty eliminates that issue altogether. And through kind of some of the specific steps that I outlined, hopefully you can see how this allows us to leverage the brainpower of individual board members to give them actual opportunities to present their own ideas and their key issues of risk, rather than having a situation where perhaps their ideas are drowned out by either more powerful or more, more convincing board members. This also creates clear channels for them to express their views, ensure that they're heard, documented, and known, and this helps foster a lively culture of debate and discussion. And so this idea of having this type of culture, this is something that's built over time, and so having that type of institutional setup really helps us make sure that we're putting that culture into place. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about the members of the board. Of course, they're the key decision makers ultimately responsible for making decisions. But the other side of the coin is also equally important. And I think many people here would argue that it's more important in the sense that the FPAS Mark II framework, as we've conceived it, really prioritizes a robust investment in human capital development, both in the near and long term among our staff. And this is built on a number of pillars. First and foremost, this idea of training and development being a continuous part of the staff's lives. So this is a fixed part of our workflow. We've trademarked, not officially, but jokingly, this idea of a dynamic learning environment, which is the idea of having really kind of non-hierarchical approaches to learning, of putting people in situations where they're expected to have very high productivity, but also to kind of simultaneously be wearing hats of teachers and students at the same time. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in our session that's devoted to human capital issues tomorrow. We demand of our staff, this is very important, the very highest standards for excellence. This includes world-class economic analytics. This includes things like having critical thinkers, and then having an emphasis on the very highest standards for written and verbal communications. We think it's very important as being an accountable public sector institution. This is something that we mentioned quite a lot, of having staff that really understand and have kind of a sense of mission-driven purpose in doing their work. And in kind of understanding that purpose and the social purpose of the work that they do, that kind of naturally demands that they have the very highest standards for excellence. So that's something that, speaking as the staff members, and that we demand of each other all the time. We also really prioritize this idea of global engagement among our staff, making sure that as economists, we're engaged with thinkers and leaders from around the world. Certainly, these workshops and conferences are one opportunity for us to do that. We host these on a quarterly basis, but also weekly seminars with some global economic thought leaders. And we've been very privileged to have some very important people participating in these. One of the other kind of really important things is having this ingrained culture of mentorship and feedback. This is, I think, an area where many central banks, but I think large institutions in general really fall short, is creating a culture where mentorship and feedback kind of occur organically. And is something that's kind of an everyday part of our DNA. And so to kind of formalize that, to really kickstart that process, we've introduced a few kind of systematic approaches, including things like a buddy system, which we've adopted, taking some lessons from the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, as well as having regular kind of feedback sharing as a part of our project, kind of a 360-degree feedback approach that's kind of project specific, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and so on. And then, pairing people at the central bank in our staff with mentors from outside the central bank. So people who are seasoned experts in monetary policy and economics and so on. All of this kind of working with these higher standards for ourselves and higher productivity, funnily enough, and perhaps ironically, actually contributes to better work-life balance for our staff. At least that's our idea. It eliminates a lot of the inefficient practices and unnecessary hierarchies that we think tend to stifle a lot of people's kind of upward potential within institutions. And we have this kind of overt emphasis on avoiding burnout among our staff. This also helps us with something that's very important, which is having more equitable hiring practices. So we're very explicitly focused on greater gender equality among our team, but also more geographic diversity for a country like Armenia. Of course, Yerevan's our primate city, so the majority of our people tend to come from the capital or from its universities. And so making a kind of an effort to hire people from outside of our traditional geographic sources, and then also tapping into, I think, what people talk about as a hidden source of potential for Armenia, which is our Armenian diaspora. So now to turn to another aspect of the framework, and I'll actually pause here and say that hopefully you'll understand that, or you've been seeing that with the kind of amount or the different types of content that we've been touching upon. We first touched upon kind of quantitative forward guidance, then we switched gears to human capital, and now here we're talking about communications and transparency. This kind of really, I think, underscores the point that the framework itself is quite comprehensive and is quite holistic. It's an overall systematic approach, and we've tried to leave kind of no stone unturned in approaching this framework. So to now come back to this question of communications and transparency, our mission very explicitly, and this is building on a lot of the work that was done with the original FPAS and trying to take this a step further, our mission is to have the very highest standards for monetary policy and transparency and accountability. And so in doing this, we ask the following questions. First, what constitutes the best practice for communications and the highest level of transparency? And two, what is the purpose of transparency? What are we fundamentally trying to achieve, right? And our experience and looking at the experience of others, having done FPAS for over a decade and a half, almost 2 decades, transparency helps us with the following things. One, it helps minimize uncertainty about policy itself. It helps support better informed market expectations. It helps enhance central bank credibility. And it serves as an important foundation for ensuring accountability to the people of Armenia and to our mandate of ensuring price stability. Transparency on its own does not necessarily achieve these things. This isn't a simple kind of input-output model, right? But this is the kind of thing that within a comprehensive framework, if we think about this well enough, transparency can be an important tool that helps us get there. And so how do we think about actually implementing these high standards for transparency and really effective communications under the new framework? So you can see on the screen what we provide as kind of an illustrative segmentation strategy. So the idea being that monetary policy has a number of different stakeholders. This includes, of course, fiscal authorities, financial markets, members of the media who are, largely take on the role of serving as an intermediary between our communications and the public itself. Of course, people in academia and researchers, and finally, and I think very importantly, the general public. And so being able to reach these different audiences, I think, is very important for us, but it requires us to leverage a number of different tools to reach each of these audiences. And so we rely on kind of a comprehensive toolkit for our communications that includes both written, oral, and I would say non-traditional outlets. So this includes things like our monetary policy report and our different types of written communications that accompany each of our decisions, Our decisions are also followed with a press conference, which is something that we've been doing since 2020. Something new that we're introducing under the framework is this idea of a technical briefing that's geared towards technically minded audiences. So these are very technical audiences, members of financial market participants, institutional investors, academics, people that are very kind of interested in the weeds of these things, but that might not necessarily, this might not necessarily attract, of course, for example, the general public or people less well versed in these things. And then finally, for more towards the general public and taking the opportunity for the central bank to communicate directly with the public as opposed to maybe relying on the media to then filter messages, social media can be a very powerful tool. And we've seen very, very good examples from around the world of central banks actually using social media as a tool to communicate directly to the public, both first for this question of kind of generally promoting financial and economic literacy and helping people understand what is it that the central bank does, what is monetary policy about, what is our framework, what is inflation targeting, all of these questions, but also kind of more operationally things like, what are our decisions? How did we arrive at these decisions? How are we thinking about key economic questions? So all these ideas, social media gives us a tool to, in rather simplistic and easy to understand language, communicate directly with the public. So we'll be talking actually on this question of society-wide economic and financial literacy initiatives tomorrow morning during our first sessions. We'll be hearing from the governor about this issue of how to develop economic and financial literacy in Armenia more broadly. And then a couple of our board members, Mr. Narek Khazayan and Mr. Levon Sakian, will also be talking about an interesting tool that they've developed, which is kind of an online learning game for improving economic financial literacy, first kind of within the central bank, but also outside of it. So to turn now to our analytical framework. So our analytical framework, we tend to, like I mentioned, I really introduced that caveat very early on in the presentation, which is this idea that we want to be thinking about our analytics and the tools that help us conduct our analysis in a very kind of healthy way. So it's economics first, modeling is a tool to help us kind of structure that economics within kind of a formal setting. Right. So within that, our analytical framework is comprised of first our kind of core models, our kind of quarterly workhorse models that we rely on. And this includes a blend of kind of traditional QPM, as well as our endogenous credibility model. And this model, endogenous credibility, which we term EndoCred, contains a number of interesting things. So first, a number of crucial nonlinearities, first related to the, as the name suggests, the question of endogenous credibility itself in terms of the nonlinearity by which credibility is lost and gained. And second, other nonlinearities, including things like a nonlinear Phillips curve. It also includes an explicit loss function. And then we also emphasize this idea of thinking about the policy implications of parameter uncertainties. We pair these kind of quarterly core models. This is, again, I think, building on a lot of what's common practice under standard FPAS Mark I with these satellite models. And a lot of these models are linear models, and they're focused on more specific things like fiscal policy, external shocks, terms of trade shocks, macro-financial linkages, and so on. So I now want to turn to this idea of non-traded sticky price inflation, which is something that I promised I'd be talking about. And the reason that we're mentioning non-traded sticky price inflation is that we think that this offers, I think, a really interesting insight, and you'll hopefully get an understanding of what we mean when we talk about kind of economics first and models as a supporting tool or analytics as a supporting tool for how we think about these things. So when we think about a question like non-traded sticky price inflation, so what is kind of very fundamentally this question of non-traded sticky price inflation? It is, to put it very kind of bluntly and perhaps losing all nuance, an alternative measure for inflation. We tend to think about this rather as a kind of building a better proxy for price stability when we're developing this measure. So the question is, does the world need another measure of inflation? There are certainly many. We've seen, I think, since COVID, I think an exponential increase in the number of alternative measures of inflation. So if we approach this question of trying to come up with an alternative or better or perfect measure of inflation, the answer, of course, is no, we don't need it. But the way we're thinking about this in terms of this idea of developing a better proxy for price stability and putting the economics first is actually, we think that this can provide a lot of value add for us, both internally in our deliberations as well as externally in our communication. So this work really builds on a number of kind of important kind of intellectual underpinnings. And so those underpinnings are, of course, Dornbusch's kind of seminal idea of kind of sticky price overshooting models, as well as new open economy macroeconomics that was developed by Ken Rogoff and Maurice Alpsfeld. I'm not sure if they're in the audience with us today, but they might be. So this idea of, again, building on this. So the way we think about this question of non-traded sticky price inflation, why non-traded and why sticky prices? So this is really built, again, using those new open economy macro underpinnings. This is built on this idea of first thinking about this idea of non-traded prices. For a small open economy like Armenia, it's obviously important for us to be making this distinction when we're thinking internally about this difference between non-traded and traded goods. On the one hand, of course, traded goods are impacted very much by things like the exchange rate. And so having a distinction between traded and non-traded for us is essential, and it makes our communication a lot easier. I think this is actually an issue that Mr. Nurbekin will also be talking about in terms of some of the communication challenges or opportunities that having this kind of analytical and institutional approach under Mark II gives us when we're thinking about talking about projections for our variables like the policy rate or the exchange rate and so on. So when we think about sticky prices, this is the other side of the coin. Sticky prices, of course, the idea behind sticky, and this is really both lifting from Dornbusch, but also from the work that the Atlanta Fed has recently been doing with developing sticky prices. The idea is that because sticky prices, of course, are goods and services whose prices are set infrequently. So because they're set infrequently, the idea is that they would incorporate a degree of forward-looking expectations about future inflation, embody some element of kind of expectations within them, and they would be a better representation of overall kind of generalized excess demand conditions within the economy. So within this context, right, what we do is we think about these ideas of thinking. It's important, one, to be thinking about traded versus non-traded, and two, it's important to be thinking about sticky versus flexible for the reason I mentioned. And so using these ideas, we think about how might we decompose the CPI using this kind of framework and grouping of ideas that we brought. How does this differ from the traditional approach? And the traditional approach is more of a statistical approach to inflation. This is why I'm asking, does the world need another statistical-based kind of alternative measure of inflation? And so where those become problematic is that they take a very kind of statistical and kind of blindly statistical approach to these things, where they try to take out items like unnecessary volatility or looking at things like trim means and so on. And so all of those approaches don't really have the kind of economic thinking driving the idea. It's kind of putting the cart before the horse in many ways. And so here with this idea, we decompose a CPI into these groups of non-traded sticky prices. And then what's left over, right, is this idea of flexible prices. So we're not thinking of, we've excluded the unnecessary or noisy or meaningless items from the CPI, but rather we've developed this grouping. And so when we look at non-traded sticky prices, we can also look at its flip side, which is something like flexible prices, right? And so flexible prices, because they're very quick to change, and they're very much kind of set in individual specific markets, and the prices for specific goods, right, are set in those specific markets, and they're often those prices often change in response to kind of idiosyncratic price shocks that are specific to those markets. When we think about these flexible prices kind of in unison and in aggregate, and when we see them moving in response to what might be generalized excess demand conditions, they can be very helpful for us as economists and as decision makers to be thinking about. Right? Obviously, many price changes in flexible markets, because of those idiosyncratic price shocks, we might not want to be responding to as monetary policymakers. But certainly there is messages and information that's coming through from what we've, quote unquote, excluded from this measure that we still want to be looking at, right? So if we think that price increases in flexible price markets are the result of these generalized excess demand conditions, and we're seeing generalized excess demand conditions taking hold, we certainly wouldn't want to allow those to kind of feed into non-traded sticky prices, right? Because non-traded sticky prices are more reflective of these kind of underlying conditions. They're more reflective of these generalized excess demand conditions. We find that they tend to track pretty well with other of these kind of underlying measures, things like wage growth and so on. And so making sure that as policymakers, we're getting ahead of these things, and when we see generalized excess demand conditions potentially ticking upwards, that we're adequately and appropriately and preemptively responding to those things, kind of perhaps well before they might even bleed into things like non-traded sticky prices. So that's kind of, I hope, kind of gives you a sense of how we think about the analytics under our framework. I will actually pause here and open up the floor to my colleagues if they have any other kind of things to add. But actually, before I do that, let me make a shameless plug as well here. So all of the ideas that we've presented in the presentation that I just walked through, as I mentioned, it was kind of very deliberately all over the place. And I say that, I think, with a kind of positive twist. All of those ideas are contained within our forthcoming book, which is titled Prudent Risk Management Approach to Monetary Policy, the Theory and Practice of FPAS Mark II at the Central Bank of Armenia. And so this book contains a very kind of comprehensive assessment of the overall kind of ideas, both theoretical and operational, of the frameworks, just a few of which that we touched upon within this presentation. So you can find an unofficial working draft of this book on our website for the Central Bank of Armenia, that's cba.am, also the Better Policy Project websites, where you can take a look at the unofficial working draft before we publish the full version later this quarter. So thank you so much. I'll now turn it over to my colleagues if they have anything to add, and then we'll open up to the audience for questions.
Yeah, so I just have a small comment about where we are. We're at the DILIJAN Training and Research Center. American University of Armenia is also housed here. They have a graduate program in economics. And so I just wanted to say how special this is. What level of intellectual Athanasio was just here a month ago in December. We have a lot of people working. The governor mentioned some of them, but we also have a research agenda that we think is really important. So maybe the governor could say a few words about some elements of our research agenda, and maybe I'd fill in the rest.
Yeah. So thank you, Doug. Diljan, thank you very much for presenting one piece of the research that is done in DILIJAN Training and Research Center regarding the non-traded sticky prices, which we think is a wonderful measure of what actually central banks should do in terms of managing the excess demand. Besides, I'd like to stress that we're trying here to do something else. And then people who are in the audience and want to jump in and be part of that adventure with us are very welcomed. But regarding the topics of structural macro research that we're planning to do for coming years, I would like to mention topics on migration, which are also, from macro perspective, related to housing as well. There will be a research on technology, AI, related productivity stuff that comes out of it, which I think is a fascinating story. And then we want to have it in-house to research and to understand it better. And the third piece of our research agenda will be about aging, which is also another very important topic, not only for developing countries, but also for much of the developed world. And those are the three. Probably that I'll take a liberty and announce that if there are any other topics related to geopolitical risks, deglobalization, and something like that, we can also include that in our research agenda. But those are the three that at this point I'd just like to highlight. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Governor. So we'll open up to questions from the audience. Yeah, Yuri, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. So I have a question about the scenarios, because you're saying that you're moving away from the baseline, right? One thing that I noticed is that you formulate two scenarios around the current expectations of the market. So either, being more hawkish or more dovish than the current expectations of the market. But then couldn't you say that the current expectations of the market are actually the new baseline?
Yeah. So it's a great question because I think and thank you, Yuri. I think it gives us an opportunity to really explain, I think, a lot of important elements of the framework. So when we think about market expectations and the information they embody, right, in many ways they represent an aggregated view of the market's best guess of what the most likely future is, right? And in that sense, they serve a similar role as what a central bank's central projection might otherwise do, in that they embody from actual market participants or experts this view of how the future is going to unfold, right? And it's that kind of most likely singular view. Where this differs from a baseline and why I wouldn't call this a baseline, while it contains many of the benefits in terms of offering that kind of central view, why I wouldn't call this a baseline is that when we think about the baseline and the folly in the baseline, a lot of that has to do with kind of the operational elements of, one, how the baseline is constructed, which creates a lot of issues, and two, how the baseline is perceived. So in putting forth market expectations, this isn't, one of the issues we have when the baseline serves that role is that this is a central bank communicating a singular interpretation of how that most likely future is going to unfold. Now, whether markets believe and the aggregation of kind of market views suggests that that is, what markets view to be the most likely future, it's fine. But for the central bank to adopt that kind of singular central projection and put that forth as its view of this is how I believe the future is going to unfold, and you should take lessons from this in terms of how I'm going to act, that all those issues that we brought up in terms of limiting policy agility, in terms of creating this kind of self-imposed constraint on the central bank, those don't exist with that kind of market expectation. So to put it more simply, right, the market expectations provide a lot of the benefits of the baseline scenario without the pitfalls of them being associated with this kind of expert view of that most likely future.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for the clarification. And I think there's a question in the chat, by the way.
Yeah, so we have a question from Alexander Tellis in the Q&A. So I'll read that. In a scenario-based approach, is the public perception of the economy and the response of civil organizations taken into consideration when analyzing possible market response? For example, when deciding if interest rates should be lowered, how important is the societal input in building these scenarios? Is it taken into consideration at all? Or are we looking only at market fundamentals and political implications during the decision-making process? How can the central bank help? How can the public help central bankers take better informed decisions?
Recording in progress.
Societal concerns or behavioral changes as well. And I think in that sense, this is actually a much in the FPAS Mark II, when you have a scenario-based, and I want to emphasize least regrets approach, which means that you actually consider the scenarios, and then you try to find out, based on the individual board members' views, what is the least regrets, what is the least cost for these scenarios, which scenario implies, what's the policy which implies the least cost for the society. And that's, I think, what is really, really important, because in this environment, every board member, he has to make a choice. What are the key things that he is really worried about? And in which case there is much higher cost. And of course, the board members are elected by the parliament in Armenia. And so this is their job, actually, to think about a wider society rather than the market expectation. So in that sense, market expectation is just a a communication tool around which you can organize your thoughts. But I think the least regrets, really, if you want to do a least regrets, you cannot really do this cost assessment unless you really think about the societal costs. And this is really, I think, the job of the board member, and this is why actually board members are elected by the parliament. And this answer, of course, depends on the setting of the country.
I just wanted to respond to Yuri, because we're going to be talking about those kind of issues in the next session. But I just wanted to say also, because it was related to your question about the priorities for modeling. In the United States, where you have options markets for the Fed funds rate, you can get easily predictable, like what is the market anticipating the most likely path for the Fed funds rate. Obviously, for countries like Armenia and Georgia, those markets do not exist. We do want them to exist. And in fact, we think this framework might actually incentivize the development of those markets. So we already have a tradition at the Bank of Armenia of surveying commercial banks, okay, getting their macroeconomic forecast, including the expected policy rate. Okay, so and a very important part of our research, which is being undertaken in collaboration with the National Bank of Georgia, because they face exactly the same issue, we have to construct a path for the expected policy rate, Yuri, and that would be the market path and so on. But how do we do that? That means that we have to do a bunch of modeling, and we don't want to do the modeling just on Armenia. We don't want to do the modeling just on Georgia. We want to do the research on a broad list of interesting countries that have interesting similarities. So in particular, Israel, because they have very rich index bond markets. We can construct the expected path of inflation, not only 10 years ahead, but 5 years ahead and even 2 years ahead. So that's a data-rich country. Also has a history of dollarization, a country where because of inflation targeting and because of, in some sense, more stable, they faced a fiscal crisis. That was the principal reason and stuff. But because of the development of their macro framework, including monetary policy, it's provided some stability and so on. So that's a great example where dollarization in Israel has fallen. It used to be the CPI was indexed by a parameter of 0.27. 0.24 was non-traded housing, okay, which is, again, why we're emphasizing non-traded sticky prices in this analytical framework. So we have a group of countries that will be very interesting for us to model with small open economy models. We can't do that by ourselves, but we can do it. We can reach the critical mass of resources based on my experience modeling at the IMF by collaborating across central banks to be able to support that kind of research. So Yuri, right now, we only use things like one-year bond rate in the secondary bond market, okay? But the plan is obviously to do a bunch of research so that we can construct a measure of the expected path, both based on information from financial markets as well as surveying the commercial banks and so on. Okay, so there's some technical issues there that I think are very interesting. Partly to deal with the criticism that some people say that when you eliminate the baseline, you're eliminating a public good for those countries that don't have well-developed financial markets. So I hope that helps you a little bit, but that's part of the questions that we're going to be getting into in the next panel.
Thank you, Doc. That's very interesting.
And so we have another question from the audience, this is outside the scope, so we'll be dismissing this question. Are there any other questions from the audience on this issue that we've been discussing? So hearing none, we will transition to a brief coffee break for those of us in person. For everyone else, we'll be back in about 20 minutes, 7 o'clock Armenia time, for a panel discussion with Charles Goodhart, Athanasios Orphanides, Armin Nerbekian, and a few others. So please, we'll see you all back in 20 minutes. Thank you so much.
Recording stopped.
Charles or Asia, I just want to make sure that you guys are on here.
Yeah.
I'm at.
Yes.
Anika, Yuri, Athanasios.
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, good.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Thanks, Ika. Okay, good. We start, please. So, thank you very much. It's an honor to have the speakers that we have today. Charles has presented at a Better Policy Project seminar, and so I already know the answers to his questions. But I thought that these would be great questions for this symposium. So the first question to Charles, and in fact to all the presenters and so on, is what do they think about the prudent risk management approach to monetary policy? And of course, we want those remarks to be based on their research and their knowledge, and so they can feel free to also talk about that research and knowledge. And so that was the first question. And Charles' answer is, I like it. I like the scenarios-based forward guidance, but you're going to have problems explaining this to journalists and politicians, okay? And that's a little difficult because on the one hand, we're saying that we have to do the right thing, and on the other hand, we're saying we're not gonna have problems communicating it and so on. So we have Yuri here, who used to be a modeler and who is now into communications, and so we're going to be looking to him on the panel to talk about those kinds of issues, and that's going to be the issue that Charles. Larry Shimbry, one of our external advisors, it was the thing that he was asking us over and over and over again, based on his experiences being the deputy governor of the Bank of Canada and so on. So he was part of the people from the outside that helped us to build the communication framework. But Yuri, we could always benefit from help from people that are in communications. We have Ika Mikabatse, who will then go next. She's the deputy governor of the National Bank of Georgia, and they are already trying to communicate policies of least regrets. So she's going to be talking about that as well. And then finally, we have Deputy Armin Nerbekian. Now, tomorrow, Armin is actually, yes, tomorrow Armin and Shelva, who runs
Recording in progress.
policy at the National Bank of Georgia, he's just popped in right there. they will talk about the experiences going from a non-FPAS central bank to what we describe as an FPAS Mark I central bank. So this entire experience was documented in a book co-edited by Tobias Adrian and Maurice Opselt, where we took stock of the experiences of the Mark I central bank. So tomorrow, Armin, as well as Shelva, will talk about the experiences at the National Bank of Georgia and the Central Bank of Armenia of how they invested and went from being a non-FPAS central bank to an FPAS central bank. And by an FPAS central bank, what we mean is what Vahe and the governor was referring to, a central bank that organizes its resources around three essential questions. Where is the economy today? What are the underlying forces in the economy, and what does the central bank have to do with its policy instruments to achieve its objectives? And when we think of that policy rate, or we think of that not as capturing that very short-term instrument, as not capturing policy, what really matters to financial markets is the expected path of the policy rate in the future, because that path is what influences longer term interest rates that are relevant for household decisions. In addition to that, the exchange rate, which is a very, very important part of the transmission channel. So they're going to be talking about how much investment was required to go from those non-FPAS central banks that don't have those frameworks. Many of them are advanced economies. And so the specific question to Charles is, can central banks and advanced economies learn more from the experiences of the flexible inflation targeting central banks that basically develop these Mark I regimes? But they'll also talk about how you go from Mark I to Mark II, incorporating this uncertainty and so on. And of course, one question there, which is to Charles, do you just jump from being a non-FPAS central bank to Mark II, or through Mark I to Mark II? Okay, so the broad question is, can central banks in advanced economies that do not have these FPAS frameworks, can they learn from the experience of the flexible inflation targeting central banks? I'm referring to New Zealand, the Czech Republic. They represent actually most of flexible inflation targeting central banks right now. So Charles, can you start? We will start with you, and then after we go through a round of questions dealing with these issues, we will then turn to Athanasio and get into the whole issue of rules-based policies and so on.
Doug, thank you very much. I've got some slides. I'll try and go through them very quickly. And I spent a little bit more time on what I think are the more important issues. Let's go on to the next slide, please. Next slide. Fortunately, no one knows the future, and there's a great deal of uncertainty, many risks, and the future very frequently is not at all like the past. The assumption in most of the flexible inflation target countries has been that you can provide a single forecast with a single peak mode and a distribution of possible outcomes around that is frequently symmetric. Often that is not the case of the real world. Many contexts have a double peak. Either Trump or Biden wins an election, either the war in the Ukraine continues or it ends. And assuming that the forecast should involve 50% of each eventuality would not be very plausible or likely. Next slide, please. Even after taking account of all the likely risks, if one should still believe in a single peak forecast, the probability of getting close to that outcome must be extremely low. On the other hand, concentrating on a single peak forecast is very easy for observers, politicians, journalists to assimilate, and indeed market players. But it tends to lead people to focus on the forecast errors rather than the changing risk outcomes. Now, one of the things that I wish you would include in some of your papers is the attempt that Mervyn King used to try to correct for this by developing the fan chart approach, with the emphasis on both the scale of the spread of outcomes and the skew compared to the mode. Unfortunately, that turned out to be a gallant failure. For example, when Mark Carney came in, he ignored it in the sense that during the period in which he was in office, the skew was kept at 0 and the spread was kept constant throughout the whole time. And although Hugh Pill, the chief economist, has tried to reinstate it by changing both the skew and the spread, very little note has actually been taken of that, and it's not been used much elsewhere. It was, I think, a very sensible attempt, but it failed. And I think that needs to be taken into account. Next slide, please. Now, is a single peak forecast internally consistent with central banks claiming to be data dependent? When should you not be data dependent? And that would imply such confidence in our ability to forecast that it would be hardly believable. Now, clearly, what I think would be a much better alternative is what Doug and the FPAS two people are trying to introduce, would be to focus on the key risks and do scenarios in each pair of risks. For example, real wage rigidity or not such rigidity. Now, here I want to spend a little bit more time. One of the problems here is that the risks, the number of risks are really very large, and they change over time, which are the important ones, so that what you would have would be a forecast, say, the first forecast of the year, in which the key risks that are taken into account would be in the labor market. Then maybe things would change, and in the second forecast, you would get the key risks are in the energy market. And then maybe in the third one, the key risks are some form of political risk. For example, whether we're going to get a more protective system if and when Trump wins the next presidency, or we're going to go back to a more open economy. And one can think of almost a very large number of alternative risks. And that means that the forecast is always going to be changing in terms of the risks on which it's concentrating. And it's going to be very difficult because the forecasts are always changing their bases of which risks are being considered. It's going to be very difficult for outsiders to, if you like, to compare forecasts and outcome. And they're going to find it much more complicated and complex.
Recording.
Then everyone will simply focus on the central forecast, and you will get back to the single peak forecast. If you do a double forecast, more or less, better or worse, then you're going to be asked immediately what you think is the relative probability of each risk scenario. If you actually answer that, people will then try and do a single peak forecast for themselves. Can you go away and say, your guess is as good as mine? Again, it's a question of communication. What you actually say about the numbers that you produce through your forecasting mechanism. Next slide, please. Now, President of the Bank of England uses market forecasts of future official short rates in its single peak forecast. That's been attacked, for example, by Lars Svensson as being inconsistent with the bank's own expectations. My guess is that Ben Bernanke will recommend that the Bank of England switches to the US dot plot approach. Now, that's also got a number of deficiencies. For example, do the dots differ because of differences in beliefs about what is likely to happen in the forecast, or difference in, given the forecast, the best way to tackle what is going to happen? So what's the cause of the spread? And also, each dot presumably assumes that they're 100% certain of that outcome, where of course they're not. They know very well that there's a great deal of uncertainty about the future dot. But it'd be relatively well suited to a risk scenario approach. And again, I think that in the presentation and how you communicate this approach, you actually have to discuss whether and how you would apply a dot plot approach to what you're trying to do. Next slide, please. Now, would a scenario system based on changing risk structures, would it make a central bank less democratically accountable? I think not, because it would still be accountable for hitting the inflation target or the exchange rate target after responding to unforeseen shocks. And indeed, the balance of responsibility for persistent, inevitable failure to hit the target between the effect of unforeseen shocks and poor forecasting is always difficult to assess. And having a risk scenario approach rather than a single peak forecast might make the exercise easier rather than more difficult. Next slide, please. Now, what would happen if senior politicians familiar with simple single peak forecasts should instruct the central bank to go on producing them? I don't know. Perhaps we just have to cross that bridge when we come to it. But now I come to the final point that I want to make. Next slide, please. Next slide. There is one more slide. Oh, you didn't get the next page.
Yes, looks like this is the last one.
Well, the point that I make of the single page, last page, which doesn't seem to be there, is do you have a central forecast, a baseline forecast against which you do your scenarios, and then not publish it? Would that actually be possible, acceptable? Transparent? Would it leak anyhow? If you don't have a central forecast and then not publish it, how do you start? What are the mechanics? Now, as we heard, one of the suggestions was that what you do is you start off with the market forecasts. But the market forecasts themselves may imply a view as to the differing risks, which are different from those of the members of the board of the central bank. In other words, the market forecast is not itself neutral in any sense. It could be that they assume that the risks are either worse or better, are more or less. So can you really rely on the market forecasts as being sort of neutral rather than themselves taking a position on some of the key risks of what you are concerned? So I think the question that I sort of end with, and I've started a way to talk about it already, is can you do a scenario exercise without having a central forecast somehow behind it? And if you're going to have a central forecast somehow behind it, can you not publish it? And is it actually acceptable simply to take the market view? And let me take the US, for example, at the moment. The market assumes, or appears to assume, that interest rates are going to come down a great deal faster than I think the Fed believes. And that I think is true in several other countries as well. In other words, it's not central. The market has taken up a position with regard to the risks concerned that is in no sense neutral. So is it actually fair to start off with the market pattern or path, expected path of interest rates, because it is in no sense a sort of, in my view, in no sense a reasonable, unbiased forecast itself. Different people can have different views from the market. It is the relationship between the scenarios and the central forecast that I think is so critical. And the problem here is, can you have scenarios without a central forecast? And if there is a central forecast, will anyone take any notice of the scenarios? So that's where I want to leave my concern.
Okay, so thank you so much, Charles. It's an honor. And Charles not only gives us advice about monetary policy, he's been encouraging us to do work on fiscal. And so these research items that the governor was referring to are partly motivated by much of the input that Charles has written about in his book on the importance of aging and so on. So I just want to start off because you asked very specific questions, Charles. So I think the answers are easy. Armin can maybe take a first stab at your questions. But to respond to some of the issues that you raised, when we discuss these three scenarios, okay, we also have a table in the monetary policy report that basically has a whole taxonomy of shocks, okay, so and risk factors. And so most of the time, that additional scenario, that case X, most of the time we wouldn't quantify that. It would only be times like the summer of 2021. That would be a really good time where the case X could help us stress the importance that if inflation were to turn out to be a lot more persistent, we would be prepared to take the necessary action. So Charles, like when we think about picking these case A and these case B and these case X scenarios, most of the time we would not have a quantitative case X because, you know, when you start following a line and it's extreme, at some point everybody realizes that the line in some sense doesn't make any sense because something would happen in an extreme scenario like that. Okay, so I just wanted to just make those 2 points that we also have in the monetary policy report a taxonomy of different kinds of shocks, stagflationary shocks, rate moderation kind of shocks, and bread and butter shocks that were demand and inflation move positively. Okay, so I just want to clarify those things. Armin, do you want to take a stab at responding to some of those specific questions?
How many minutes do I have? How much time? Because I can talk forever. These are very interesting questions. 3 minutes?
3 minutes. About 3 minutes, yes.
Okay. Yeah. Let me first, in terms of I'll go quickly. Okay. In terms of the fan charts, I think fan charts are very useful communication device for the reasons that Charles mentioned, both in terms of communicating the spread and the skew. But I think what it doesn't do, it actually doesn't tell any story. And I think this is where the fan chart is problematic. Because, and this, I think this, you know, I don't know what Ben Bernanke will recommend to the Bank of England, but I think I don't like the dot plots either. And the reason is because we see numbers, and you can go to August of 2021 and basically look what was the story that the Fed was telling, but I don't really know what is the underlying story under each of that dot, and that is my problem. Because the reason what I'm looking for when I'm looking for the central bank communication, I want to understand why are they making certain decisions. I don't only want to see what decisions do they think they want to make, but why are they making the decision. So in that sense, I think dot plots are not going to solve the problem. Fan charts are very useful in terms of communicating the amount of uncertainty and of course, the skew, but I don't think they're telling the story. And this is where I think, the full-fledged scenarios are really, really important. That's one. I think the second question, the excellent question in terms of the how are we actually going to communicate, because everybody is obviously, I fully agree on it, is going to demand for some kind of clarity. But I think there as well, I want to go back to the transparency, because the real question is, how are we actually making the decisions, right? Because communication is an derivative of how are we actually making the decision. And in an accountable and transparent world, we're supposed, again, to going back to my previous point, we're supposed to explain to the public how do we make the decision. So if some central bank doesn't consider scenarios in making their decisions, by no means they have to actually, publish scenarios or avoid the baselines. If this is the way that they are making the decisions, they should be transparent about it and go ahead and publish the baseline and communicate that this is what in their view is the the single pink most probable scenario. What we are saying, probably, when it matters, it's not the best way to make a decision. And I think, Charles brought very good examples, when you can have this sort of dichotomy, no single scenario can be a very good description of the world. So I think the real change that we want to make, and we were actually doing it before as well, but we formalize it, is that to think of how the board make the decisions. And the reality is, when we make a decision at the board, most of the time, maybe it's because of our regional and geopolitical situation, I don't know, but I think it's the case in most of the countries. Most of the time we basically discuss, what ifs, what if this happens, what if that happens. Once you have it, once you really make the decision that way, I think it's just, we basically have to explain it to the public that this is how we make a decision. And I think, and we have been trying to do this, for some time now. So it's, of course, everybody wants to have a single baseline, but at the end of the day, what I learned is if you tell a interesting enough story and narrative, people like to listen to it. So that's my bottom line. So I think so if you tell two stories, they even like it more. But I think this is this is of course a bit of a joke, but I think to summarize, the key question is how are you really making a decision? And then our responsibility is to really communicate how are we doing it. I think I absolutely agree on the probabilities. I think we should not go and try to be mechanical in terms of assigning probabilities and giving some scientific sense to these numbers, like somebody really calculated and one scenario is 43% probable, another one is 57. I absolutely agree. Once you get into this game, yeah, people are just going to average this and you're going to get to the baseline. So I absolutely agree. So I don't think this should be a mechanical story. It should be interesting narrative. It should be how board is really thinking about these stories. And I think this is the key. Because the last question, I want to tackle the last question, but maybe we can at the end.
We'll come back to that because there's a natural segue here into Charles' question. Ika Mikabatse, who's the deputy governor of the National Bank of Georgia, I think she might actually have an answer, Charles, to one of your questions in her presentation. So I'd like to turn to her now. Right now, for example, the market in the financial market in Georgia is expecting the policy rate to fall over time. Okay, and so she will explain why the policy rate is higher. It's very similar story to the Fed. So Ika, if you could take us through why you're doing policy the way you're doing it in Georgia. It sounds like least regrets to us, but in a Mark I framework. Okay, Charles, the Bank of England is a non-FPAS central bank, so that is, we have to establish that right from the very beginning. We don't have much to learn from those experiences. We have much more to learn from FPAS Mark I central banks that satisfy those three essential ingredients. So Ika, please, this is a bank that has an FPAS Mark I framework.
Thank you, Mr. Laxton. It's dear distinguished colleagues. It's a great honor to address this symposium alongside this such leading economists. Let me begin with a very brief and general introduction discussing the National Bank of Georgia's approach to monetary policy, namely how our approach can be linked with the main principles of FPAS Mark II. As it was absolutely brilliantly explored and explained during previous session, in modern complex economic environment, transparency in policy decision-making is more demanding than ever. Our interest in FPAS Mark II is stemming from its robust approach to managing uncertainties and non-linearities as in case of our colleagues from Armenia. This may help explain the policy stance better, answering, for instance, the question you just posed, which I will address shortly. At the National Bank of Georgia, our current research initiatives, activities, in fact, are closely in line with the goals of FPAS Mark II. For example, we work on non-traded sticky price inflation, which we believe seeks to develop better simple proxy for price stability, which is the main goal of ours. Similarly, as you mentioned, our research on the yield curve is designed to support improved transparency and efficiency in financial markets, which is crucial for effective monetary policy transmission. Understanding financial market expectations in data scarce environment like we have, our colleagues from Armenia pointed out also, is key in communicating of policy. And at the third last point in my introduction is emphasizing the fact that while we are inspired by global best practices from our colleagues, we try to remain tailored with our Georgian unique economic context. We're focused on integrating these new insights in a way that is most relevant to our economy. Now, coming back to your specific question, how do we reconcile significantly below target at the end of the day's reconciliation of significantly below target inflation with still quite high policy rates in Georgia? Yes, you are right. This answer lies in the policy of least regrets. I would say that another name is risk management approach to the monetary policy, saying that while inflation is low today, policy preference is asymmetric due to the last several years of quite high inflation and credibility issues stemming from that. In other words, we might be fearing higher than target inflation more than lower than target inflation, because if we accidentally get or allow high inflation, higher than targeted inflation, we can regret it more due to dollarization issues in our country, then we would have regretted lower than target inflation. So this is exactly what we call policy of least regrets. This is our way of addressing monetary policy credibility in our country. And having a framework that explicitly helps in communicating this least regret strategy policy approach is indeed useful and worth exploring further. Let me finish by saying that this meeting, this symposium, offers an invaluable platform to share experience, to learn a lot. We are eager to explore future potential of FPAS Mark II and its alignment with our strategic goals. And thank you for organizing this symposium.
Thank you very much, Ika. Yuri, I was thinking about turning to you now, but I might give you the option to hold back and go through Athanasio so that you can get the whole picture. But do you have some remarks now that you would like to make in response to what has been said now, or would you rather wait until after Athanasio and then wrap it all up?
I prefer to wait till after Athanasio.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so it's obviously a great honor to have Athanasio here. We actually had John Taylor provide remarks on FPAS Mark II. In that seminar, there was a consensus that the most important thing is actually what Athanasio is going to tell us now. About thinking about rules. So this is not Athanasio speaking. This is also, I think, John Taylor, or at least our understanding of what John Taylor said in that seminar. So Athanasio, I remember in 2004, when we were in San Diego, you promised to write a paper. I'm still waiting for that. So maybe this will be the start of that paper.
Thank you, Doug. So I hope you can hear me. If you can give me the right to share my screen, I can also show you slides. But I'm going to start by saying that I remember very well the 2004 AA meeting. I will bring this back in a minute. I do remember very well we had a very, very useful meeting. I don't think we had agreed to write a paper, but there is still time to agree on the details and see how to do this. And I very much appreciate what the work that is being done with the Central Bank of Armenia and the BPP. I really like the output of what I see so far, and I hope that what I offer as advice would help. Again, I cannot share my slides, so the alternative is perhaps you can bring them up on your end, because the host has disabled the participant screen sharing, as I can see. So maybe you can bring the slides on your side.
Go ahead now, it should work.
But let me start by saying that what I really appreciate about the prudent risk management approach to monetary policy is that it recognizes the risks of sticking with what academics would call optimal policy, and all of the efforts we see in academic journals using toy models and trying to devise policy that is based on assumptions that may or may not hold in practice. And that's fine for academic publishing, and simple toy models can actually help build a lot of intuition, but it can be deadly for practitioners to then take the results from that work and then try to formulate a policy with it. Now I think I can share my slides. So let me go to this one. So I hope you can see my slides now. Yep. Okay, good. So the aiming to achieve what is optimal under under assumptions that are not to be overly simplistic, can be counterproductive. And this is the temptation I would warn against. That would be the basis for the one recommendation I have, which I'm pretty sure is going to be very similar to what Doug mentioned and John Taylor would have brought up earlier on. The temptation to try to find optimal policy can instead be the cause of major error. And you guys already mentioned, it has been stressed repeatedly at this symposium, how important it is to deal with uncertainty. And this is where I'm going to remind you of the San Diego meeting. It was almost 20 years ago. It was on January 3rd of 2004. This is when Alan Greenspan gave his address on risk and uncertainty in monetary policy. And he started with that very nice summary sentence. I'm going to quote, "Uncertainty is not just an important feature of the monetary policy landscape, it is the defining characteristic of that landscape." So yes, Doug, a sentence like that, should have us and many others think hard about how we can write papers to address this point. So there is a lot to like in the prudent risk management approach monetary policy. Examining alternative scenarios is incredibly useful. What I want to do is focus on another element that I believe is important to ensure robustness, and that is the role of a simple policy rule that can be used as a cross-check. I'm going to provide an example based on the Fed's post-pandemic inflation experience. And my main recommendation is going to be really to add a simple policy rule as part of the package, following a criterion for good policy that was developed two decades ago by Jan Vikstad at the Norges Bank. And if you haven't done it, if you're not aware of it, Norges Bank at the time was at the beginning of implementing inflation targeting. In the terminology that you are following, it was an FPAS Mark I central bank. And at the time, Jan was the chief economist at the bank, trying very hard to develop a framework for good policymaking, much like what you're doing and what we're discussing this symposium. With the idea being to consider the challenges faced by policymakers in practice and try to ensure that policy would be robust. So in assessing this, he came up with a list of criteria, and I highlight here what criteria number 6 is. You can see it on the screen. It says you can have your framework. It can tell you what the optimal path is going to be. That's going to look good and everything. But then criteria number 6 says it may also be useful to cross-check by assessing interest rate setting in the light of some simple monetary policy rules. If the interest rate deviates systematically and substantially from simple rules, it should be possible to explain the reasons for this. And this is in order to discipline the policy process to avoid what may end up being major mistakes. So develop a benchmark and use that benchmark to make sure if your policy deviates a lot from that benchmark, you have a good explanation. So under a simple, robust rules and benchmark, it's useful to, there is another issue that this would address, which is the fact that decisions are taken on a meeting-by-meeting basis and discretion. And this is a framework that every central bank is following by necessity, but it opens the door for some other challenges that we face in practice. Behavioral biases that sometimes creep up, other influences that can be important from time to time to policy. So the fact that we are taking decisions on a meeting-by-meeting basis opens the door for these things. This is one of the elements that creates some disadvantages with discretion, and having a simple rule would actually help maintain monetary policy be more systematic. Now, the whole point is simply to cross-check the the proposed policy setting and to see if there is a deviation, as Jan Kvikstad told us 20 years ago, make sure you have a coherent explanation. And if the explanation is not convincing, then perhaps the policy setting should be rethought. So this is the whole idea of having a simple rule, making it public, making public the prescriptions, and communicating the deviations from that. So let me show you the example. We are all aware of the inflation experience after the pandemic. If you look at the U.S., it's pretty clear. Just look at the inflation picture that the Fed lost control of inflation, at least for a while. Now, in my view, this was a policy mistake that by now the Fed is back on track. I will show that to you in a minute. But it was a policy mistake that in retrospect, we can all agree, even the Fed officials are telling us policy was too accommodative, no question about that. The question is, was this evident in real time? Is this something that a more robust framework or guidance from a rule could have helped? Well, actually, we could have seen in real time that policy was too accommodative. So what I have in this chart is a proxy of the real federal funds rate. This is using year-ahead real-time projections from the Service of Professional Forecasters. This is a measure that had been available to policymakers in real time in the U.S. since the late 60s. Of course, inside the central bank, the benchmark inflation forecasts can and indeed are being employed to assess what the real interest rate is. So this is just a real-time rendition that would approximate what would have been also evident inside the central bank in real time. And you can tell from this that indeed in 2021 and early 2022, the real interest rate by this proxy was at a historic low. And this is an ex-ante measure of the real interest rate. This is not an exposed measure of the real interest rate. So, this is a picture that is quarterly. It's a proxy. It's not exact. Doug mentioned earlier, more recently, and especially in advanced economies, and even in many emerging economies, we have better data. We have financial data that actually allow us to track these things much more precisely. So, actually, have in this figure a picture of the daily market-based ex-ante 2-year interest rate. You can construct this by looking, the black line is the inflation swap 2 years out, and comparing that with the OIS 2 years. And you can see the policy mistake evolving in 2021 as the economy was coming out of the pandemic. Inflation expectations were rising very fast. The Fed decided to actually peg the nominal interest rate at 0 for too long until March of 2022. This is something Milton Friedman has told us in 1968 we should be very careful not to do, but the Fed did it anyway. And while he was doing that, the real interest rate, this is the 2-year real interest rate, kept falling and falling and falling and falling. Well, we know what that does. It's not magic. This added to the inflationary pressures, and this is the monetary policy contribution to the problem. So this is the error that exposed. We can all agree was there. The question is, I'm not going to say, by the way, that all of the inflation would have been avoided if the Fed had not committed this error. This is just something that contributed to an overheating of the economy. This is the component that could have been avoided. And the question is, could this have been assessed in real time? Well, of course, people were following these things. They knew that the real interest rate was too low. They must have had some modeling, some concerns, some advice that was telling us, it's okay to take this risk. Let's take the risk of inflating the economy. What I'm asking is this something where a simple rule would have helped improve policy by giving a warning on what the Fed could have done? So I'm going to show you an example. This is an example where I have it here on the second line. It's a one parameter difference rule, very, very simple. this is really following on the policy research that has been done in the last few decades, particularly the seminal contribution by Ben McCallum in 1988, who argued, let's use a simple rule with a monetary base to track nominal income growth. And then John Taylor's 1993 contribution saying, yep, let's have a benchmark rule and make sure that policy becomes robust with that. So the example I have here is a policy rule that we had developed at the Fed when I was there more than 20 years ago, drawing on that experience. Again, what does it say? It says, well, look, just monitor the economy and see whether nominal income growth, this is N, is growing too fast or too slow relative to what is normal, the benchmark natural growth rate of the economy. This requires some assumptions. You need to have an assessment of what potential output growth is. We have that in our models. We need that. We have the inflation objective of the central bank, so we can add them up. We get an assessment of what nominal income growth is. And we need to assess the current state of the economy, meaning what is happening now and in the next couple of quarters, really. We know that what happened a year ago doesn't really matter. What we need to see is where is the economy now? Where is it going the next couple of quarters? This is how we use the best judgment of the forecasting team at the central bank, not using models to tell us, what do you think is going to happen 2 years from now? No, just use the best judgment, which is incorporated in short-term forecasts, and then see what the imbalance may be in nominal income growth relative to potential output growth plus the target. So these are the inputs to the rule. This is real-time assessment. Now, inside the central bank, they can do this with their internal forecast. What I'm doing here is showing you the picture based on publicly available data. These are the median several professional forecasters' projections. They're published by the Philadelphia Fed in the second month of every quarter from 1992. It's very simple. Where is nominal income? The blue line. How does this compare with the natural growth rate of the economy? If it's too high, tighten a bit. If it's too low, ease a bit. That's all. And this is what can form the basis of a policy rule. Whatever is the interest rate you had the previous quarter, simply use this as a benchmark to add to that. What are the policy prescriptions you get from this, and how does that compare with the Fed funds rate? Well, actually, the Fed has not deviated that much from this very, very simple rule over the past 30 years, all the way until the pandemic. And this is the lesson we can pick up from this. If you look at this, yep, the Fed actually has been tightening and easing policy in accordance to these rules at the zero-lower bound. When this policy rule was telling you have to ease policy more, the Fed was actually doing quantitative easing, which is just fine. It's exactly what you're supposed to do. But then you see that at the very end, we have a problem. In this 30-year period, we have one period of a very large deviation, and this is what I want to focus as an example. I can actually show this to you in greater detail here. These are the inputs to the rule, and you can see late 2020, the economy is recovering, telling the Fed effectively, well, you need to start considering when you're going to start normalizing. During 2021, in every single quarter, this policy rule was telling the Fed, well, you guys, you need to tighten by 100, 200 basis points just to make sure you are not very far away from what would be normal policy. And of course, the Fed didn't do it. And the question comes back, isn't this an example of a simple rule that could have helped the Fed effectively be more robust in its approach? Now, my reading of this episode is that the framework that the Fed has in place was not resilient, and we have an example with a post-pandemic inflation of how it failed. And this is an example of a lesson that in the next revision of the Fed's framework, I hope they will actually take this into consideration and go back and take take better account of the advice from Ben McCallum and John Taylor and many others about incorporating advice from simple policy rules. So the one recommendation I have for the framework is that including a simple, robust rule in the analysis can help defend against many of the pitfalls that we have associated with meeting by meeting discretionary policymaker. It forces the policy committee to explain when there is a major deviation from a simple rule. I think if the Fed committee were forced to explain why they were deviating so much during 2021, they would have recognized that they couldn't really explain, and they would have actually acted faster. I'm giving you one simple rule as a starting point, but of course, policy research at each central bank is what is necessary to ensure that you have a robust starting point, and this is where we need policy research, as we've shared, is part of the framework, continuing evaluation over time to see if the benchmark that has been adopted remains appropriate, and whether it needs to be adapted from time to time. That's all in terms of recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So we are actually, based on your presentation, we've discussed what measures we'll take to think about doing that. One of the issues is obviously the measurement of nominal GDP and the GDP deflator, because of big measurement errors. So one of the things we've been doing is to say, could we create a monthly model that has the unemployment rate as a proxy? So in your framework, that could be a proxy that's observed in real time, not revised, as well as non-traded sticky price inflation. So the question is, could we come up with more practical real-time measures? Okay, that's kind of the first question. Second question is, your analysis of the past, we could also extend that for models. Okay, and one of the reasons why we emphasize rules is that there's, in our model framework, there's this idea that we can't have an exogenous interest rate. This goes back to why we don't look at the Bank of England stuff. For example, during COVID, they had scenarios where the interest rate was 1%, inflation was double digits, and inflation would be returning back to the target. So that is illegal in the Mark I framework, because it's based on this idea that there has to be systematic behavior by the policy maker in the setting of interest rates and so on. So what about, could you maybe just respond to those two things? Could you extend your simple rule with data that would be observed, higher frequencies like monthly, the monthly unemployment rate, and maybe a better measure of inflation than the ones that you referred to? And second, how do you see also testing the rules that you've come up with in a modeling framework? And there, you might not remember our plan to write the paper, but hopefully you remember calling me up in the middle of the night and saying, you need a model. And I asked, what kind of model? And you said, any model. And so Yuri, that's a nice transition into Yuri, because he used to be a modeler, and he's kind of given up on that and turned into communications. But if you, just before we turn to Yuri, Athanasio, how do you see the research specifically moving forward in terms of testing these rules?
Sure. So let me address your questions in sequence. So first, the simple rule I highlighted here, this is based on nominal income. Of course, nominal income can be broken into real income and the price level. And depending on the country and the data that are available, there may be the introduction of additional error when these things are broken up. There was something in Ben McCallum focusing on nominal income. And in Armenia, I recall last year when I was studying the evolution of the framework, I realized that the central bank was actually following a version of the McCallum rule, targeting nominal income with a money base, like a long time ago, before the FPAS Mark I was adopted. But this can be done with the central bank's favorite inflation measure and another measure of economic activity. And on economic activity, using Okun's law, one can indeed rely just on the unemployment rate changes over time. So this simple rule indeed can be translated to responding to inflation forecast over the next years or less, deviations from the target, and responding also to whether the unemployment rate is increasing or decreasing. It's very simple. If the unemployment rate is projected to be increasing in the next couple of quarters, ease a bit. That's all. That's all it's telling you to do. But of course, Okun's law is imperfect, so this would need to be assessed based on the country. And models are needed to do evaluation and see whether the performance would be good enough. Now, the important thing with model evaluation is that very important to introduce as many of the realistic imperfections that policymakers face in practice in doing monetary policy evaluation as possible. I'm going to start with the uncertainty about natural rates. One of the reasons I actually like the specific rule that I highlighted is that it avoids requiring assessments of R star or U star, the unemployment rate, or other things that could be quite complex. Think about the equilibrium exchange rate in a small open economy, for example. These things would be part of your modeling exercise. I realize the necessity of doing that. But in model evaluation, in policy evaluation, it's very important to ask the question, should policy be based on the point estimates that the staff or the policymakers have of these concepts in real time? Now, in research that I have done with others at the board going back 20 years plus, the conclusion I drew was that that's not a good idea. And I would actually ask you to go back to that. Now, I see that you have on the program Bob Tetlow tomorrow. So I'm going to advertise one of the papers he's done at the board that I thought was, in my view, of his best papers at the board. He took the so I'm giving this to you as advice for how you could apply this in your setup. He took the Fed's models over a period of 10 plus years and said, how did data and models and parameters in the models ended up being revised in this period? Can we compare alternative policy frameworks and rules and see how robust they would be now that we have 10 years of revisions in model estimates and data? And that actually can help you totally throw out a lot of the policy rules that are extremely fragile to data and model uncertainty, and actually help you in designing a good rule.
So, Yuri, you used to be a modeler, and you abandoned us to communications. So most people that are communications say we have issues as modelers. So could you please, you could respond to anything that you heard, and just please.
Yes, sure. I'll share my screen as well. I do have a presentation. Please let me know if it is visible. I think it should be visible now.
Yes.
Can you see it?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. So I think my presentation is largely a response to the one done by Charles Goodhart, because he explicitly raised the point of the media. And I'm from the media. I used to be a modeler. That is absolutely true, but a junior modeler, and now I've been in media for a while. So I think my contribution there is probably the most interesting. I can say that the simple rules that Athanasios just described would be very difficult to communicate, I think, even though they're simple in the media. But the scenario analysis, on the other hand, I think actually I'm going to make the case that it can work really well, and that the damage from not doing something like this, so pretending to be an expert forecaster, is quite real in the online media space. And finally, I just want to make some comments about, if you use the scenario approach, how can you communicate to make it work? So, for example, Charles mentioned the fan approach of the Bank of England that didn't quite work, and I might make some recommendations about how to make it work. So yeah, I'm the founder and host of Money and Macro Media, which is primarily a YouTube channel with about, for those of you who don't know it, I'm of course a little bit less known than older institutions such as the Financial Times or Economist, but we have our YouTube channel with about 340,000 subscribers all over the world, mostly working professionals and students. And our goal is to keep the audience properly informed about the global economy, which I think synchronizes well with what will be discussed tomorrow. So, as Doug mentioned, I have an academic background. But instead of, I switched from models to sort of the picture that you see there with a map of China, where importers and exporters earn foreign currency / spend foreign currency. And so I try to use animations rather than equations to explain still the same, hopefully, quality of economic stories. And actually, I often have already relied on scenario analysis in the media. So in the media, there is, of course, this temptation to use very specific and certain terms because, that sells rather well. But I didn't like that coming from a modeling background where I also use scenarios. So I have used scenario analysis, and it worked rather well for me. And sort of the reason why partially I started this channel is that I think, if I go online, you can already see that there is considerable mistrust with the general public when it comes to central bankers and their communication. And I think that started with the global financial crisis shock, where the predictions were, of course, off by a long shot by bankers that used, I think, for simple rules for a large extent. And then I think other sources of this mistrust that I see is asset price inflation rather than regular inflation, which central bankers didn't talk so much about. Then, of course, the COVID inflation hit, which nobody had expected. And so all of these were sort of bad predictions. And if you take the scenario approach and you think about the world at an uncertain place, that is not surprising. But if you sort of present yourself as an expert forecaster, then you could imagine that the general public, believes you at first, and then when it doesn't happen, a lot of your credibility will be lost. And I think in relation to that, there's, often still a lot of jargon being used, even in central bank conferences like this, and a lot of equations, and that's difficult for the general public to comprehend. And I think the result online, at least, and the online media landscape is growing very quickly, is that conspiracy theories and sensationalism and misinformation really thrive. So I have here 3 pictures of thumbnails from YouTube, and you can see the view count. And so, for example, 2 years ago, a video was published, "Hyperinflation is already here, you just haven't realized it yet," by a channel called Economics Explained, which many people think is a serious channel. And that got 3 million views, sort of conflating very high inflation with hyperinflation, which are obviously very different. And then you have these videos about how to survive central bank digital currencies, sort of seeing a large conspiracy there. And at the bottom, you see my own video having still, I think, quite a few views, 255,000. But, paling in comparison to these other much more sensationalist channels conspiracy theories, if you will. So that is sort of the battle that I'm fighting online, to try to win back some ground sort of for the science of economics, using clear language and animations and scenario analysis to hopefully win back some of that credibility. So that's my first point, that there is already serious damage from, I think, using to a large extent, pretending that the world is less uncertain than it really is. And that brings us, of course, to scenario analysis, which I have already used. So for example, here you can see a picture of a video that I published 7 months ago around the election of Erdogan. Turkey's economy cannot hold out much longer, referring to the dwindling reserves in the Central Bank of Turkey. And I made this scenario analysis, and I also tying to this is how I presented it. This table you can see over here. So I'm in the media now, so I can be a bit more liberal with my language. So I said, okay, there's this Turkish miracle scenario, there's an orthodox recession, and there's an inflationary collapse scenario. And then I gave sort of my assumptions there. So the Turkish miracle, maybe based on getting a lot of more loans from Arab states such as Saudi Arabia, which I think kept the Turkish economy afloat much longer than most economists had expected. An orthodox recession, including a rate hike, which is something that surprisingly happened. And then, as you can see, sort of referring again to Mr. Goodhart's presentation, I just went ahead and gave them a likelihood. Again, something I could probably do because I'm in the media. And I made clear, like, I'm a pundit. This is not scientifically calculated. This is just based on sort of my gut feeling, which you obviously cannot do, but maybe still learn something from it. Now, none of these scenarios exactly came to pass. And also this rate hike, I sort of thought was the least likely. And actually, since then, the Turkish Central Bank has hiked rates a lot after Erdogan won the election. But actually, the comments under, so I highlighted a couple, were really positive. So it was like the first comment that you can see on screen, love it. Thanks for keeping it balanced and playing out all scenarios. Never change that approach. Another one's of the top comments, so these were popular comments. Keep it up, really good stuff for a non-economist. Love the probability distributions and admitting uncertainty in your predictions. And I think that really struck me as important. And my likelihood, my least likely scenario, I think ended up being the closest to reality. And yet I have received zero flack from my otherwise quite active follower base that I got it wrong, so to say. Why? I think because I admitted how uncertain the future is. Like, as you can see, all of these likelihoods are, fairly low, and also they don't add up to 100, because I always say, there's an extra dark corner, if you will. And I've had this multiple other times as well. For example, talking about a potential of a recession in Europe, where I said this was last year when the energy crisis was at its worst. And I said, the least likely of the scenarios is a dovish scenario, so a mild recession. And that's exactly what happened. We got a mild recession. But because I had also given sort of my assumptions, saying that energy prices would need to come down rather quickly, and there should be no further very strict escalation in sanctions. I think people actually, also there forgave me completely for getting it wrong, so to say, because actually the assumptions that I had sort of spelled out did come to be. And so my scenario, I think, made a lot of sense. And so I hope this is, a little bit of evidence that it can work. Scenario analysis in the media can work, even though a lot of my colleagues don't do it. And I can also say, like, hey, I'm quite a specialized channel, so maybe it won't work for the general public. So like my viewers read The Economist and the Financial Times, maybe not a mainstream newspaper. But still, I think it saves a lot of criticism is one of the main takeaways. So my lessons learned are from a media perspective. So take it, of course, with a grain of salt. Central bank credibility is really damaged due to overconfident forecasts. There is for sure a better demand for central bank communication. And my initial experimentation with scenario analysis, I would say it has been successful. But media needs views. So this is also a point that Charles raised. Well, indirectly, perhaps, is that like media loves these concrete predictions. It's super easy to report. Central bank says inflation will drop by 2% next year. But the media also loves conflict, is what I would add. The media also loves stories, is a remark also made by the Central Bank of Armenia representative. And what you can see here, for example, is a video I did on inflation, where I pitted 1.5 years ago, team temporary versus team permanent. And people love that. So I think there is a possibility to live up to sort of the media incentive, which is to get views, because that's how we make money, right? So that's the economics of media. And still go with a scenario approach. In this case, I used two scenarios: the hawkish and dovish inflation scenarios, and people loved it, and that video was successful. So I think it's definitely possible. And if you want to make it work, comparing it to the fan chart initiative that from the Bank of England that Charles talked about, I think if you want to make it work, you maybe have to take these incentives by the media into account. So you need to give them a story, so to say, like give them. And that might be counterintuitive. That might be something that doesn't come natural to central bankers or to academics. And I would caution, of course, but you can make it a little bit easier by making these tail risk scenarios that are, for example, talked about in the report. Like the media would love that, I think. A risky X and Y scenario is what they call it, right? Or frame the A and B scenario that you mentioned as a hawks versus doves scenario to get this traction with the general public. I think that can really work. That's at least my experience so far. However, I think it's really important to stress what each scenario depends on. What are your assumptions? Because if you make them clear, people can see and more easily forgive you if you get it wrong, because your assumptions maybe were right, even though the end result was wrong. And then I think it's also really crucial, if you do this, that you follow up. So, my Turkish scenario that I mentioned didn't come true, but I made a follow-up post saying, hey, actually, Erdogan raised rates, which was in line with this scenario and this assumption that I made that Erdogan wouldn't raise rates. So I think these are my main takeaways. And finally, I just wanted to say that yes, as Charles said, there is a risk that people end up going with your highest likelihood scenario, or most people. But at least now you can either defend yourself, after the fact, and you give ammunition to your defenders in the broader public debate to defend you, because you have always been clear that it is uncertain. So even if the general public runs with the baseline, if they start criticizing you, it's now easy for others, like academics, to defend the central bank and saying, hey, well, this is not true. This is not what the central bank said. And that's very different, I would say, than it is today, where too many central banks, I would argue, are expert forecasters or pretend to be. So that's my presentation, and my comments largely on Charles's.
So Yuri, I'm going to ask you some follow-up questions, and partly respond to Charles Goodhart's remark that he thinks that Ben Bernanke is going to recommend the dot plot to the Bank of England. I don't think he will. That would be a very bad recommendation for the following reason. To understand the Fed, and we're going to be talking about this tomorrow, Larry Summers actually asked us this question to go back in time, because we've been using the US in our research to test FPAS Mark II. We tested it for well over a year, writing these teal books and so on. And when you look at tomorrow, we're going to look at in detail at this in the session with Larry Summers responding to his questions. But when you look at what the board staff does, it's really consistent with Mark II. The dot plot is very problematic. You can't connect the dots. That's related to the complex nature of the Fed, that it started off as a bunch of regional central banks where you had a bunch of independently minded people. So I think in the case of the UK, they have a monetary policy committee. They're not representing specific sectors of the economy and so on. They're meant to have a mandate for inflation targeting. So it would be very unwise, basically, to recommend a dot plot. They first have to develop a framework that's consistent with forecast policy analysis system principles, which starts off with where is the economy today, what are the underlying forces, and what do I need to do with my instruments to achieve my objectives? And again, that's not just the policy rate today. That's an opportunity to set the policy rate and to communicate monetary policy. So Armin Nerbekian and Shelva from the National Bank of Georgia will be asking those questions. They used to be non-FPAS central banks, and they invested resources, usually 2 to 3 years, to develop that kind of policy framework. And so they'll be talking about those experiences, about what policy was like before they had FPAS Mark I. And of course, Armin will be talking about how they went from Mark I to Mark II. The problem is that that's going to be 1 o'clock in the morning, because we're doing it at 9:30 in the morning here in DILIJAN. I'm just saying that we'll be recording that, releasing it on YouTube. So if people, when they do wake up in the Western Hemisphere before the session with Larry Summers, we will have the benefit of that. So my question to Yuri is, like, how do you view non-FPAS central banks, which are typically advanced economy central banks like the Bank of England or the ECB? The Fed is kind of doing it because they do it at the board, but they only publish it with a 5-year lag. So all that analysis we now have for 5 years ago instead of right now, which is what you will have when we do FPAS Mark II. So
the question is how I view non-FPAS central banks, like the Bank of England, and also does the ECB, but the ECB does publish like these fairly confident predictions, right? So what's the difference then?
So the difference is that when we organize an FPAS Mark I central bank, we ask, where is the economy today? What are the underlying forces, and what do we need to do with our instruments to achieve our objectives? So that means that you have a forecast where the interest rate has a policy rule, like something like what Orphanides, there has to be some kind of systematic behavior of monetary policy to anchor the economy. And so the old style central banks, the non-FPAS central banks, they obviously have to, first of all, build an analytical framework that's consistent with an endogenous interest rate forecast. And second, they have to change all their internal procedures and processes. This is why it takes 2 to 3 years to develop FPAS frameworks in Norway or New Zealand or the Czech National Bank or the Central Bank of Chile. All of these central banks, have invested in this FPAS Mark framework and the processes to support them internally to improve internal transparency, because that internal transparency is basically the foundation for external transparency and, of course, accountability. So so the real question is, which I asked Charles, can advanced economy central banks learn more from the experiences of the smaller, open, and more vulnerable economies, okay, from their experiences, because they seem to be totally ignoring those experiences.
So I would say from more of a media and general public perspective, it's not so clear. that this difference exists between central banks. So that's the first thing I would say. And the second thing is, I do think that, but that's maybe a little bit broader and outside of this FPAS relationship, that major central banks can learn from smaller central banks if the world is, as you in your report say, is becoming more uncertain. And then, for example, as Armenia has had this huge geopolitical shock to deal with, and that's something that smaller central banks deal with a lot more. Like, if it is correct that this is something is a wider trend, this fragmentation of the world into geopolitical blocks, then in that regard, I would say that central banks from bigger nations can learn a lot from those in smaller ones. So I realize this is not completely in line with the question you asked, but it's the best answer I can give.
So the FPAS Mark I central banks were based on the experiences of the 1970s. Okay, so they were based on experiences of stagflationary shocks. We designed models where you can't solve them with exogenous interest rates, because if you can solve them in your models with exogenous interest rates, it means that fundamental role of monetary policy to adjust the instruments sufficiently aggressively is not satisfied in that analytical framework. But I think what I'll do, because Armin is going to be presenting details of this, as well as with Shelva, that have experiences going from non-FPAS to FPAS. I'll let him maybe do a short reaction to this, or advertisement for what he's going to talk about.
I'm sorry, Doug, but I want to misbehave and do something differently from what you asked. By the way, just a quick remark. From the online, you basically see maybe 5 or 6 of us, but there are lots of people in the room. And I can tell that Yuri is really a communication specialist, because I was paying attention and his presentation was the only one that nobody was looking in their phones. But can I just go back to what Charles asked, and also maybe we can give a chance to Charles to respond. I think the very deep fundamental question that he asked at the very end, and Doug, you somehow said it's very simple, was that, can you really construct scenarios without a baseline, right? I think that was the key question. But here I want to be very specific. So Charles, now I take my pen and I'm listening to you. What is the definition of a baseline forecasting? I'm writing it down to answer your question.
The definition of a baseline is the forecast from which you start. And the forecast that I understand that is done in Armenia is you start from the interest rate path that the main banks in Armenia expect to occur over the next 2 years. You can start, and that worries me, because I'm not sure that is a very valid forecast, because it may be very different from what the central bank itself thinks is likely to happen.
Can I follow up? Because if you define the forecast, if you define the baseline as something from which you start, then by definition, from that, your definition, of course, there is no way of producing a scenario, because you always have to start from something, right? And that's why I asked, but fundamentally, if we don't talk about case A's, case B's, and FPAS Mark II's, 5 years before this, what would be the definition of baseline forecast that would you give to us?
I was trying to react to what I understood was done. Now, you're, I think, suggesting that you can have your case A and your case B without starting from anything, that you can just go straight ahead and have 2 scenarios, and you don't need to have a baseline. I think that is, I agree that is possible, but I think that, as I said earlier, I think that you will immediately get asked, but which do you really believe? Which do you think is more likely? And that then, if you reply to that and say, well, I think that the low wage version is more likely, then people will take that as the forecast and dismiss the other. So that you're stuck, I think, with the problem of either not telling them which of the scenarios you think is more likely, and that leaves them with a degree of uncertainty, which is in itself potentially valid because the world is uncertain, but which they won't like. And I think that my question is not so much on your procedures, which I, on the whole, generally greatly support, but how you are going to communicate it to a world which wants to have a certainty, which actually is not there. I think that you are trying to force people to face uncertainty, whereas what they are wanting is to get a degree of certainty. So you're trying to do something that is actually, in terms of communication, I think very difficult. And I wish you the best of luck. But I think that the problem that you face is not one of mechanics or procedures; it's one of communication. In that sense, and I agree with Yuri. But Yuri has said that people quite like the way he does it. But I think that the kind of requirements and the kind of expectations of what is an official authoritative body like a central bank is very different from what people expect and want from an individual, however talented and able and good at communicating that individual might be.
Can I I want to respond this because of course I accept the difficulty, right? But what I was trying to say is that the question, if you can actually, because the way you I think asked the question was, first question was, can you construct scenarios without starting from some baseline? And then the second question you ask, if it's not possible, can you avoid publishing it, right?
Yeah.
Right? That was the case. But what I was going to say is that just mathematically, every scenario has a 0 probability.
True.
It's a mathematical abstract truth that everybody accepts. So by definition, the concept of a baseline is just, I'm sorry to use this word, is a nonsense. Because it's just basically what the line you choose to draw in your report, right? Because all of them have 0 probability. Now, that's why I wanted to make this clear that baseline forecast is just a line, as a case A or case B or any other line. And if you define a baseline forecast, for example, in a mathematical terms, assuming that there is some real underlying distribution of things in the world, and it's just something which goes into the middle of these distributions, of course, you can define it as a baseline. It will be, of course, nobody knows this. And of course, you are absolutely right to say that you don't know if market expectations, where does it lie relative to this, right? Yeah. That is why I absolutely agree, but I wanted to bring this point that the baseline forecast is really a concept which is very difficult, very difficult to define.
Yep. Because
everything has 0 probability. Now, they take me to, Athanasios's point, right? Because in this particular way, and by no means I want to dismiss the difficulty, in terms of communicating, but I think the real reason we want to take market expectations is very similar to what Athanasios was saying, right? Because we want to use a simple reference as a communication tool relative to which we explain why do we make a decision. I think this is the reason that we basically take the market expectation. So for example, Athanasios was saying, you can use the simple rule as a communication device relative to which you can explain, and it makes you explain what are your underlying assumptions, that make you deviate from this simple rule. So I think in that sense, market expectations is a very similar rule. We take it because it's something which matters for financial markets. It's something which is observable, you can see it, and you can use it as a communication tool. So I think it's really, really important to make the point that definition of a baseline is really something very, very on a conceptual level, very, very debatable.
But market expectations could be wildly wrong.
Of course, and that is why our job is to discuss why do we think it's wrong, and if, for example, they are wrong, we think that market, for example, if I'm at the Fed and I think that market expectations are now very wrong because they somehow give such a false confidence that inflation will go back to the target, then the role of the board would be to use this line and to explain that we think it's wrong. These are the reasons we think it's wrong, and this is why we think this scenario is something we strongly believe in. This is exactly why I think it's really important, because market expectations are wrong, but they matter. So this is my best take to this not so simple question, Doug, after all.
So we're going to be coming back to these issues tomorrow in the session with Larry Summers and so on. But what I wanted to do was to thank the panelists and to give them one last round for the final word. Of course, starting with Charles, and then maybe Ika, and then maybe Athanasio, and of course we can end it with Yuri. So are there any final remarks that you would like to make, Charles, and then Ika and Athanasio and Yuri?
I like very much what you're trying to do, but I do think that you have to focus very much on the issue of communications. You're doing the right thing, but communicating it will, I think, be perhaps more difficult than you appreciate.
So, Ika?
Can I maybe tie into that, because I have another commitment that I need to move on to, and this is the perfect segue, I think, because even though I took a little bit of a counterpoint to Charles, I actually totally agree with that conclusion that it will be very difficult to communicate this. But my point is that yes, it's difficult, but it can totally be done.
Okay, Athanasio or Ika?
Thanks, Zach. So it's let me add something to the communication angle. So a simple rule can actually help the communication quite a bit. It provides the benchmark that market participants can use for assessing what the systematic reaction of policy is going to be to whatever scenario materializes in the future. And that can be much more useful for forward guidance than providing a market path or the dot plot, which is, I agree with you, Doug, that's a problem for the central banks that do this. And it also improves on market expectations and discussions you just had, because the market expectations usually reflect the agglomeration of several scenarios. And it's much better to have a risk, a policy rule that gives information about how the central bank is going to respond to the alternative scenario, and then let markets internalize that rather than use the average of the various scenarios that are reflected in market prices. But overall, good job. Keep it up. Bye.
Thank you. Ika, if there's no more, Shelva, I noticed that you lit up, but Ika left. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I was just wanted to let you know that Deputy Governor is having some internet connectivity issues, and I would just add with the final comment, and I think that Ika would agree. Having this market like a reference point is useful for two reasons: to communicate, and also to tell to the market in which direction they should be adjusting their expectations. Because what we will be arguing tomorrow with Armen is that because market expectations are important, and because, as Armen argued, they can be wrong, it's exactly important to show to the market explicitly how we differ from them, so that they adjust their expectations and they incorporate these expectations into interest rates that are relevant for the economy. So this is all about improving transmission to the economy. Thank you, and this has been very interesting discussion.
So I'd like to thank everybody. It's really late here in Armenia, and you've all it's almost 9 o'clock here. So I'd like to close the session, and the governor just said that we're waiting for you to come in person next time, so that we can continue the conversation at dinner. So thank you very much for the opening remarks. Vahe, wonderful presentation. Armen, sorry for surprising you. Thanks, Athanasio, Charles, Shelva, Ika, and Yuri. See you tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Recording stopped.